In this, our October episode, at the beginning of Scorpio season, we introduce Giulia Turolla, graduate of the esteemed Bologna University, discussing her upcoming book, The Key to Ancient Greek Religion. In this episode, Giulia and I discuss a wide range of subjects related to the history and practice of Greek religion and the fluidity of theological concepts in Greek culture, from metempsychosis to the denizens of the Underworld. We also tackle how the historical concept of paganism has evolved over the centuries, and one of my favourite subjects, the nature of mythic time. We also explore the manner in which the Greeks dealt with death and how best to honour these ancient gods today in our modern practice. Giulia has asked me to add that English is not her first language, but I think that we can all agree she is a wonderfully eloquent speaker. I am your host, Matt Hadfield, and I am very happy to welcome Giulia Turolla to the Hadean Press Podcast. Hello, Giulia. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for having me.
Giulia, could you tell us a little about yourself and how you became interested in the study of ancient Greek religion and magic?
So, talking about myself is always one of the hardest thing to do in this kind of things because, it feels a bit when you are the new kid at school and you have to present yourself and you want to establish immediately that you are a very cool person, but which is usually awkward in the end because you want to say something cool like that, but it comes out that the things that I think are cool about myself are very often the same ones that people think are very weird. But I mean, this is a podcast for people that are interested in the occult. So I feel pretty confident that your audience is kind of weird. And so I'll feel right at home. So I have been interested in witchcraft and both, the practice and the study of witchcraft literally for as long as I can remember. Like I was in kindergarten doing these little spells with buttons and whatnot. And I could always feel the clear presence of magic in religion in general, even when it was very carefully hidden, as it is in Catholicism, for example. So all these interests, the study of ancient magic and religion, as well as of ancient cultures as a whole, naturally came together in a very early moment in my life. And of course, ancient Mediterranean cultures, so ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and ancient Egypt as well, were of particular interest to me because I am Italian and that past is deeply embedded, in the land I live in every day. It's in my blood, in a very physical way as well. And their stories are the stories of my ancestors. So they have shaped us in many different ways and they continue to do so to this day. And these passions have also shaped my life journey, as on the one hand, I decided to study archaeology at the university, which at least in the University of Bologna, which is the one I graduated from, this means that you first will get a bachelor's degree in classical letters and then a master degree in archaeology. But at the same time, I was active in the pagan and occult community since I was around 15 years old, so quite young, and I ended up becoming a priestess and a teacher, inside of that community. So the two things were always very intertwined for me. And my master thesis was on ritual homicide in ancient Egyptian curses. So it's not as if I was ever in the broom closet to begin with, it was quite clear out in the open.
Bologna University is the oldest university in the world?
Yeah, as it often happens with these kind of things, there is a sort of struggle, in deciding which one is the oldest in Europe. And one of them is Bologna, and the other one, oh, I forget, I think it may be the university from Oxford, maybe. it's surely, if we think about Western university, so the way in which our culture conceived universities, because again, there was something similar that was older in the Islamic world. But when it comes to Western university, then yes, it's surely, if not the oldest, depending on the version you want to believe, at least the second oldest. And it was very nice in a way, but also very daunting, because in Italy, it's known to be one of the hardest university, because of course it's like all these professors, they want to live up to the hype, so to say. They feel the weight of the ancestors waiting on them, which is something that you can really see, because everywhere you go, like my own department, the Department of Archaeology, was in this beautiful historical, building, and you have all these statues and busts of, teachers from the Middle Ages looking down at you like, you poor peasants, you won't be able to measure. But yeah, so it was very nice in a way, but also quite hard. Also, universities in Italy are very different from, colleges in the US. And so when I hear from friends from the US saying, oh, I had such fun in college, we did this and that, and then we got drunk and the parties, it's not like that in Italy.
Right, yeah. Much more serious?
Yeah, like for example, it's very formal for starters. Like I remember when we had students over, even from Spain, from inside Europe, they were much more relaxed with the professors. Like, they were not using a formal ways of address, or in Italian we say they used they talk with them as we talk with friends, the same grammatical structures, so to say, which in Italy is a big no-no. They even have, that they have these titles, they come back directly from the Middle Ages. Like there is a title that you use for like some types of, depending on the role they have inside the university, it's like amplissimo, which means very big, very ample, huge. It's, all these very, very strange titles. So yeah, it's way more formal. And also there's a bit of sadism to it, in that in our culture, there is this idea that if you are really, really a good professor, a good teacher, your students will struggle a lot. And so they will say, like, for example, oh, I had this test coming up. I remember, for example, one of the tests I had to take, it was on Latin literature. You did that with 7 different professors, and each of them, it was one test, but with 7 professors, and each of them had their own program. And you did that in like 3 days. It was 3 days for a single test. And it's like, it's not written, it's like oral with every one of them. And there was a sort of a competition between them on which one was the one that would, just, how do you say, like when you not fire a student, but like fail them the most. Because the ones that has more fails is the, the baddest, strongest professor.
So the person I mentioned to you before in my email, who I'm writing about at the moment, Cecco Diascoli, he was the head of astrology and medicine at Bologna University at the turn of the 14th century, and he also had this manner of communicating to his students, like, so grandiose. I don't know, maybe it's just the translation, but he has this certain way of communicating in his lectures. It sounds, it can sound so patronizing.
Yeah.
Where he often says, "You young people," in this way. It sounds like, "Oh, my ignorant students," like you couldn't possibly know how wonderfully clever I am. I can hear his arrogance coming through from like 700 years ago.
It's like that, today as well. So it's a bit of a struggle. But one of the, and feel free to include this if you want, because I mean, this is really verging on blasphemy here. The fun thing about Bologna is that it was like for most of its medieval history, it was under the control of the church, okay, because it was in the papal state, in the church state. And so some people think of it as if, oh, they must be very, pious and dedicated. And it's really not like that. It's because they were so long under the church that right now it's one of the, you would say, more communist-friendly regions in Italy. And there is a way of saying in Bologna, which is very popular, like it's just, a figure of speech that is used quite frequently. Like you would say, in English, and it's sochmel, which means suck me or suck it. And the story, like the medieval story to explain this figure of speech, is that God was angry at people from Bologna because they were fornicating and there was sodomy and going on and all sorts of stuff. And so he sent his archangels to Bologna, and they were beautiful, And so when they came to the doors to punish the people from Bologna, the people from Bologna sodomized them because they were too beautiful. And then God became angrier and angrier. And so he started selling all these orders of angels and they were all, defiled. And at the end, the only ones remaining were the cherubs. And so, you know how the cherubs are,
Yes.
And so God sent them. And when people from Bologna opened the doors, and they were already eager because they were expecting this strapping, angels, they saw these things that were like, bodiless, flighty heads.
Yeah. Yes.
And they were perplexed for a couple of minutes. And then they said, oh, okay, then suck me then,
Wow. Thank you. All right.
So that gives you an idea of the vibe of the city, so to say.
I will include that part. That was brilliant. Okay. All right. Let's move on to the next question then. So, what was it about Greek myth which ignited such a passion in you?
So I always had a very strong interest in myths and fairy tales in general from different cultures. And when I was a child, I had quite a collection, of books because I was always asking for them. But there was a book in particular that sparked a real passion in me and that opened the Pandora's, vase, so to say. And it was a collection of ancient Greek myths that I found in my grandmother's library, which, by the way, my grandmother is very, very Catholic. So I think she would be horrified to know that I'm not, that's how things goes. So I think I was around the first year, in primary school. And I had this habit of going raiding relatives' bookshelves because even when the books were too hard for me to read, really, I loved looking at all the pictures and imagine what the stories really were about. And as soon as I started reading this book, that I was able, to read it, I was hooked because, the stories there were wild, There was everything from adultery, cannibalism, murder, homosexuality, these seductive women, strange beasts, and all the stuff that I was not allowed in a way to know about were in there, And of course, there was the pull of the forbidden, so to say, but most of all, it was that these stories felt different in a fundamental way. Like they were not just meant primarily to teach me a moral lesson in a way, or even to entertain me. And they just were, like in the same way in which the sky is, in the same way in which the earth is, like they had been there since the beginning of time, and they will be there long after I am gone. And I think that it was this sense of eternity that was the thing that drew me the most. I could feel that there was something hidden beneath that, and that if I immersed myself in these stories again and again and again, sort of by exposure, I could say, I could have found secrets. That's how it felt like. And I think that in hindsight, I was right.
So, we are here today really to discuss your upcoming book, The Key to Ancient Greek Religion, which you describe as a tool that is meant to be used. Could you explain to us something of the purpose of your book and what led you to write it?
I think that a good number of my students are largely to blame for this book because it happens quite frequently that they will come up to me and ask for advice about where to find the specific information they're looking for. And the truth is that no matter how many wonderful books of different kinds have been written on these subjects, and there are, tons of them, they either tend to address an academic audience, and so while being very well detailed and well researched, the kind of information they tend to focus on is usually different from the one practicing pagans or sorcerers are mostly interested in. Or when they are openly directed to the wider public, the wider pagan and esoteric movement in specifically, they usually don't contain the kind of historical detail that many people, especially in this time and age, are looking for. Or they often tend to offer a perspective that is based on the personal spiritual path of the author, which is fantastic, It's wonderful in its own way, but sometimes it's not the kind of thing that people are looking for. And so I thought that I wanted to write the kind of book I would have wanted to have, and that is meant to be a tool in the sense that, you can read it from top to bottom, trying to deepen your understanding of ancient Greek religion as a whole. You can jump and go directly to the sections that are dedicated to your favorite god or goddess, and then, let curiosity, if you will, push you further along. Or you can just exploit it as if it were a mine and you want to dig, nuggets here and there in the footnotes, for example, or in the bibliography, which is, I'm sorry to say, massive. Like, I'm a bit ashamed of that bibliography because it's simply unreasonable.
Don't be. Everyone loves a good bibliography.
I was very repentant when I had to compile it all because it's very, very boring. You can use it to spur your own research, or you can keep it on your shelf as a resource that you can consult, when you feel the need to do it. The book is divided in two main parts. The first one is aimed at providing a general overview of various aspects related to ancient Greek religion, while the second part is dedicated to an in-depth analysis of gods and goddesses. And at the end of each chapter, specifically because I wanted it to be a tool for people to, broaden their research and deepen their interests, I have provided a reading list, a suggested reading list for those that wish to delve deeper into specific topics. And, a greater abundance of resources is available in the bibliography, as I've said. But just with the suggested bibliography at the end of each chapter, I think there are close to 100 sources overall.
Very nice. Yeah. So it is very much a tool. It's something that anyone can pick up, utilize, and find more and more rabbit holes to explore.
But that they can become nerds like me.
Yeah.
It's a gateway drug in a way.
And it's quite a massive text as well, isn't it? It's not a small book.
No, it's a bit of a monster. I feel bad for the editor, really.
You also mentioned that the focus of this book is on cultic practice. Could you expand on this a little further?
Yes, and I also want to specify that by that I don't mean that I have adopted an overall functionalist perspective in which, the analysis of cultic actions and their ties with social structures receives more attention than the spiritual value of the religious experience on an individual or on a collective level. What I mean with that is that I have written this book from the perspective of someone that wants to know, all the pesky little details that are rarely included even in academic studies, because they are deemed either pedantic, or too specific. But they are actually extremely important for someone that approaches these practices and these divine beings or semi-divine beings as something that is still alive, not as something that is long dead. So, for example, what kind of flowers were worn in a wreath during that particular festival, for example, or how many knobs had that type of bread that was offered to that god in that specific period of time, or what kind of animals were sacrificed to that god or that goddess, and what others were usually to be avoided. So this is the kind of stuff that I'm talking about when I speak about being focused on cultic practice.
So I couldn't help but be interested in the subject of what you call the paradox of the past, where you delve into the cyclic nature of time. Do you think that this is something ingrained into our culture, or something more like an echo in mythic time? Or perhaps maybe a better way to say it, do you think that do you think this cycle is like an expression of the fates?
First of all, I love this question. It's a great question, and probably we could spend like the whole interview talking about this. The thing about the past is that, at least as I perceive it, it's a bit like an organic creature, a living being. So part of it decays quickly, and after even a handful of years, their depth of meaning is mostly lost. Just think about all the household items, or pop culture references that we know, but that are completely obscure to, the younger generations. Whereas there are other parts of the past that are seemingly impervious in a way to the passing of time, a bit like bones, or hair. They tend to decay in a really, really long time. And others, again, they keep existing by becoming such a deep part of us that we transmit it to our descendants, even if we are not completely aware that we are doing that. A bit like, our genetic makeup, that has been transmitted to us by our ancestor, and we will keep transmitting parts of it to our descendants. So as human beings, we keep engaging with the past at different levels and in different ways, and this keeps the past alive. So both inside and outside us, because we feel when we engage with the past, we give it value, and so we feel the desire to preserve it, but also because by the simple act of engaging with the past, we are changed by it, we are affected by the past, like we let the past transform us, And so I do believe that in this way, the eternal returns of the past, like the tides of time, are something that is embedded in the nature of existence in general, but even more in the human experience. Because as a species that takes a special care to keep tracks of the past, you know what I mean? Just by inventing writing, for example, or the visual arts. But added to this, in the specific case of Greek culture, time was certainly conceived in a very different manner than we tend to do today. So, for example, the very idea of that events should be inserted in a grid, and identified by a string of numbers simply did not exist. Like they didn't have a word, a term for date. And this was true of the Latin language as well. And events were established like by in their place, in the flowing of time, mainly by being put into relation with other events. So this was happening while that other thing was happening, and before or after that other thing again happened, and adding to this, the progression of time, we tend to see to equal, even unconsciously, the progression of time to a progression in quality. Like we are evolving, we are going towards something that is greater and better, and so on and so on. But they didn't see time in that manner. Like, it was not seen as part of an inherently positive process of advancement. Like, on the contrary, it was in the past that perfection rested. Like, and humans were constantly striving to go back to that past in some form or fashion. So in a way, I could say that it's partly something that is inherent to the human experience, but that there are also some types of past that seem to be more eager to cyclically come back than others, as if it's like these cyclical tides are built into their DNA. And I think that is something that you can really see in Greek myths, for example. Like, it's these eternal cycles coming back and becoming true again and again and again.
Yeah, and we see that sort of that looking back to the past as this as closer to perfection, all the way up through the Middle Ages, all the way up to almost like the Renaissance in Europe. That same modality of thought that discovering, say, the works of Plato or the Corpus Hermeticum was closer to the truth.
And it's changing a bit right now. I remember when I was a child, I don't know if it's the same for you, but I remember that when I was a child, you really had this strong perception that things were going to get better, and wonderful, and new discoveries and so on and so on. But right now we are discovering, and I mean, it's a good thing on the one hand, and it's a bad thing on the other hand, that, the future is not going necessarily to be better. And we are more and more looking at the past as something that we need to go back to. And sometimes this is a positive thing, and other times it's a very negative thing. It depends.
We also see this sort of cyclic time playing out in our cultures at large, really. So, for instance, we have Christmas, which is this huge event around the world that takes place annually. And it's this event that happened in the past, even if it was in the mythic past. It might not have really happened in the sense that it is a historical event, but it's something that was so powerful in our culture that no matter what we do, we can't stop it, and it evolves and it changes with cultures as they progress. So I'm really interested to sort of dive into Greek myth, a pre-Christian myth as well, specifically, and seeing how these same echoes propagate through history.
Yeah, and I think that this really brings home the point that, of course, historical, like establishing if an event is really historical, like if it happened or not, is important. But at the same time, it's quite naive, like how some people that are, trying to promote a certain type of atheism, for example, have an hard-on for demonstrating that, I don't know, Jesus never existed as a historical figure. And I think that is quite naive as, as a point of view, because the thing that you were saying about Christmas, for example, that story, even if it never existed as it was told, which is very probable, it changed history in profound and deep ways, and it keeps changing history, it keeps changing people, and our world would be different if that story had never been told in that way, It's not like stories are very, very important, and stories shape the future, they shape the present, and they shape the past. So, and with the advent of social media and this new way of, transmitting information, we can see this happening in real time. Like this number of stories that are not true, but they keep changing our present in very important ways. And sometimes catastrophic ways.
Yeah, I'm really interested specifically in historiola, so that the idea of mythic stories that play out through cycles.
And the question here is a bit like the egg and the chicken. Like, do they keep happening because we know these stories and they resonate inside us, and we're like a diapason, resonating with the stories, or do we keep saying these stories and telling these stories because they are inside us from the
Yeah.
beginning? Yeah.
I just love that idea that you evoked earlier of them being like bones and they're like decomposing into this soil of, I don't know what you would say, like the collective consciousness of humankind. Yeah, but I'm really interested in that idea of jumping into historiola and myth, especially Greek myth and Greek stories as a mode of engaging in magical practice. So you take on the specific role, say, of Solomon, or or of earlier, like Orpheus and Hercules, etc., and working in that sort of headspace. I think it's just so fascinating. I really enjoy it. But yeah, so I'm really looking forward to reading more of that in your book, because it is something that I am particularly very interested in. But could you describe something of your understanding of what you would call fluid theology?
Yeah, so when we think about theology, and by we I mean, modern people, we tend to be heavily influenced by monotheism and particularly by Christianity. So uh, the whole religion of Christianity is based on a common understanding of God and of the relationship that God has with human beings, on an individual and or on a collective level. But in ancient Greece, the situation was completely different. And even if, different groups like polis, the different city states, or ethnic groups, the ethna, used to venerate, similar deities, you could tell that there were local versions that could be distinguished based on the use of epithets, for example, or the versions, of myths, which were different, depending on who was telling them and in which area they were telling them. And so there was no theology in the sense that we now think about it, like, namely, a way of conceiving the gods that was recognized by all and that was taken as the official benchmark, in the same way that there wasn't a priestly caste that had the explicit duty to research and reflect upon divinity. So there were, the Aedi, the poets, the thinkers, and since at least the second half of the 6th BCE, philosophers. They were the ones that were tackling the tricky field of theological speculation. Uh, but it's not as if their reflections were necessarily of great importance to the lived experience of religion, uh, of common people. So this also meant that religious experiences were not commonly accompanied by an instruction manual. So in the sense that you had a series of guidelines that were meant to steer the individual towards the right interpretation of what was happening, or what they were doing and experiencing. And so religion was everywhere, and religious practices were usually very clearly structured. It's not like everybody could do whatever they wanted, and they were codified. But the way in which a single person or a group formed their convictions and deciphered the meaning of their spiritual experiences was extremely fluid. And so this is what I mean by talking about fluid theology.
That's really interesting. And in your opinion, how important were the philosophers of the day, so like you said, from the 6th century BCE onwards? How much would the common man have known about, say, Aristotle and Plato and all the other classical Greek philosophers? Would they have been aware of them in general?
It depends a lot on the level of education. So it always makes me crack the fact that we have, ancient philosophers complaining. It's like the eternal returning of time. Things change, but at the same time, they never change so much. And we have these philosophers complaining that the sports stars, those that were winning at the Olympics and other, games, important games, they were more important than the philosophers. And of course, they're bitching, saying, oh, what we do is more important than what they are doing, and so on and so on. So, it depends a lot on the level of education. So, of course, philosophy was part of the education of noble families, specifically, especially men, so the male descendants, and they knew about that. But at the same time, they were a slight percentage of the overall population. And also what we see is that even if they were aware of this speculation, when it comes to specifically the religious field, what the records tell us is that this speculation did not affect largely their practices, So it was like what they were doing was not deeply affected by these feats of the mind, so to say. Of course, there were exceptions, like for example, Orphism, which was a movement, and it was not this monolith, it was a composite movement. But in Orphism, the underlying ideas about, especially what happened, after death, were very important in determining how one was to live their own lives, the general tenets to observe, and so on and so on. But generally speaking, I don't think it's not just me, like the majority of scholars agree on the fact that what Plato, for example, was saying about the nature of the gods was not that important to the religious experience of the single individual.
So I think this is really fascinating and really interesting, specifically because is it the 9th century in the Middle East, in Baghdad, you see all of these Greek texts being translated into Arabic, and then Arabic philosophers are looking back at Greece like, oh, these guys, they were so wise and they had all this wonderful wisdom, and then the Arabic sources are then translated in the 11th century, 12th century, 13th century in Europe, and then the Latin, those guys, they're reading it and they're going, wow, these ancient Greek sources, they were so wise and they were so wonderful. But during their day, yeah, like you just said, maybe the average Greek person, living on a farm with a family, living off the land, they were not probably not even aware of half of what these philosophers were talking about.
Mostly not. And also, you know what? The fact is also that it's deeply embedded in us, the idea that if we are to have a religion, then we have to agree on certain things. What happens after death, how we should honor the gods, what happens if we don't honor the gods, and so on and so on. How our behavior in life determines what happens to us after death, etc., etc. But they didn't have the same ideas. Like, take, for example, metempsychosis, reincarnation. Of course, there were some movements, and some philosophers that espoused the idea of reincarnation in ancient Greece. And that was just a possibility. It was not as if each individual felt compelled to adopt, one set of belief instead of the other. It was just, a number of possibilities. And from the point of view of culture, they felt like it was interesting to debate these possibilities, but from the point of view of spirituality, they were not like these possibilities could all coexist, and it also depended on the individual experience. And in a way, ritual, like what they did, was more important than what they believed.
Exactly. And just like you said, it was fluid, right? It's this fluidity of belief, which I think is really interesting. So, yeah, thank you for explaining that. So, this is our October episode. of the Hadean podcast. And so it's only right that we move on to the subject of the dead. Could you describe something of your understanding of the Greek rituals of death, the underworld, and how we can engage with our ancestors?
So as I've said, I've just mentioned it, even if the ideas about the nature of the afterlife were very often fluid, the ritual practices connected with death and its social and emotional impact on the family of the deceased and of the larger community were mostly consistent all over the Hellenic area. And usually they were regulated by local laws that were also, meant to prevent, for example, the spreading of diseases and things like that. And the general outline of the funerary rites as a whole was already established by the age of Homer. And their main features remained consistent, mainly in the following centuries. So basically, the events that followed the death of a loved ones were obviously also determined by the specific circumstances of the death, involved in the event. For example, you could not carry out the usual procedure for someone that was lost, whose body was lost at sea, which was a problem for them because the fact that the body, either in its intact shape or as the burned remains had to be buried, was very, very important.
If you were dismembered in any way, it was a big deal, wasn't it?
Yeah. So the fact that it had to be, whole, even if it was in the form of ashes, you had to be whole. And usually what happened was that the day after the death, the women of the family and of the relatives were really at the center of the funerary rites. They were the ones, that were dealing with all of that. They prepared the body that was usually positioned on a bed with the feet towards the door so that the spirit of the deceased could more easily find their way out. And this is something that is interesting because the thing about placing the coins on the eyes, or inside the mouth of the deceased so that they could pay for, their crossing of the river, it was a later custom that even in these later times was not, present and consistently observed in the whole Greek area. So that for us has become really a symbol of how the ancient Greeks dealt with death, but it was not like it was a later tradition and not observed everywhere. Then on the third day, the body of the dead was transported to the burial place, and the women, they could be women of the family and, of the relatives, or they could also be paid professionals, which was quite common. They showed the grief of the family with mourning cries and gestures like, beating their breasts or tearing the hair and so on and so on.
Are these women connected to the sorcerous practice of the Goes?
Yeah, like Goes, the figure of the Goes is still quite mysterious. Okay. But we do know that the name seems to be, from the point of view of the root of the word, seems to be connected with the verb that means, keening in mourning, so the cries of mourning. And yeah, exactly. And it's interesting that when we speak about Goes, the Goes, it tends to be a man, but this duty was really just for women. So yeah, it was probably tied to a type of necromancy, which, by the way, was one of the main kinds of sorcery that was performed in the ancient world. So yeah, after they transported the body, there could be ritual sacrifices, and sometimes they presented libations or a real banquet, on the graveside. But people did not usually partake of these offerings because everything that touched death in some way was compromised. So it was dirtied, by the miasma, it's called, of death.
Contagious.
Yeah, it was contagious. That's why, for example, when the family was in mourning, the people around, the relatives, the people that they knew, friends, and so on, they hesitated in going to visit them because it was, contagious. And there was a basin of water usually by the door that they could use to cleanse themselves afterwards.
Mm.
And that's also why there was no proximity usually with the grave. Like the parts of the city that were inhabited were far from the parts of the city where the dead resided, with the partial exception of the heroes. They were a different kind of dead, and so there were slightly different rules. And then afterwards, of course, they came back to the home, and then there was the banquet for the living, hosted usually by the next of kin. And if we turn to the whole complex matter of what happened after death, as a people, we have grown up in this, standard of Christianity. Christianity holds the standard for religion, and we sort of give for granted that having this common explanation of the afterlife, or how the destiny we encounter is determined, at least in part, by how we behaved in life. This is an all-important requirement for religion, but it was different for them. And even the geography, there are recurring elements. The geography of Hades was not, however, ever defined in detail. That there is no one map of the underworld, of the land of the dead. And it was, always somewhat vague for them as well. And you could access, usually they had the idea that you could access it by going in the underworld, so going underneath the earth, but you could also access it by going west,
into the setting sun.
Yeah, exactly. There is always this element of crossing the waters, but these waters could also be, they could be underground, but they could also be at the western edge of the world. And the possibility that the dead could receive punishments or rewards based on how they behaved in life, there was no common doctrine here as well. There was this general vague idea that if one's actions could influence the treatment that they received in the afterlife, but it seemed to apply more on the conduct that they held towards the gods than towards the fellow humans. To say it plainly, if you sucked it up to a deity and honored them in life, you were more likely to gain a nice afterlife, even if you killed puppies in your spare time. That was more important, okay? And I think that this is very important to keep in mind when engaging with the ancestors, because our Western culture has this tendency to sanctify the dead in general and give for granted that all of them in the afterlife will be able to guide us with wisdom and help us in a benevolent manner, which is simply not true from the point of view of my personal experience, but also of many other traditional cultures. And I also think that it's a very good thing to shake this fundamentally Christian belief that morality in life determines the outcome of the soul forever and ever. Because on the one hand, it is a lousy foundation, in my opinion, on which to establish one's behavior. And on the other, I find it naive and especially catastrophic as a belief for someone that engages with the spirit of the dead or the underworld in general, but also for society as a whole. If we believe that our souls will be punished in the next life, there is no great incentive for us to seek justice in this world,
100% agree. Yeah. Wonderfully put. So could you outline the various classifications of the denizens of the underworld for us?
Again, I could go on about this for hours, but we don't have the time, so I'll just outline the basics. There are a number of divine and semi-divine beings that were essential to the running of the underworld. So first of all, there is Hades, whose name could indicate both the realm and the god. So Hades was first and foremost the ruler of the underworld, and his nature was more strictly tied to the land, of Hades, like as the place, that he reigns over, than to the inhabitants, like the souls that were there, or even to the physical reality of death. Like Hades was not that involved with the process of dying. And that's why he didn't have, he wasn't subject to cult almost at all, really, because, Greeks were very practical from that point of view. There was not much to be gained by worshipping Hades, because he could not guarantee you a nicer afterlife or a nicer passing. So what was the point? Then there was Kerberos, the three-headed dog. Actually, the first representations of Kerberos, he has two heads. But then they try to experiment with different numbers of heads, and then they settle on the three heads that becomes the sort of, the general image of Kerberos.
The most classic image, yeah.
Yeah, the most classic.
Yeah.
And he's the first employee of the underworld, like the most ancient one to appear in the sources. And he had to guard the doors, the point of access to Hades. And also in both ways, like nobody could enter if not the dead, and no dead could go out from the underworld. Then there are Thanatos and Care. Thanatos is a bit more well-known than Care. Thanatos is the personification of death. And sometimes, they didn't speak about Thanatos that much, and it was not that much represented because the Greeks tended to shy away from representing the physical process of death. But sometimes he is shown next to the deceased, to indicate the process that was happening, like he was dying, in that moment. But Thanatos represents death in general, whereas Care, the name Care means doom of death. So she represented the specific fate, that the individual had to face. So, for example, if I were to die in battle, for example, that would be my specific Care. And that's why you find in the Iliad as well, very graphic description of Care, all blooded, dragging away the soldiers and the warriors, because that's where their doom of death has come. So it was more specific. Then there is Charon, I don't know. It's very hard for me to pronounce Greek and Latin words in an Anglophone manner, so I don't know if that's the right pronunciation.
I would say Charon.
Charon. Yeah.
Charon.
I don't know if to say that Charon. So sometimes I, muddle it a bit. Charon's appearance in the landscape of the underworld is relatively late. Like the first mentions are from the 6th BC. So he comes after Kerberos, for example. And he was never considered to be a proper god. He was more considered to be like a semi-demonic being. And probably his origins are Sumerian, because there is the ferryman of the dead that was Sumerian, and they have many characteristics in common. So that's the general idea. Then you have other deities like Hermes, of course. He functions as a psychopomp, so as a guide that can accompany the dead to the underworld. He does that already in the Odyssey, so it's a very ancient role for him. Then you have Persephone, and the name Persephone, Kore was the maiden. Persephone was the name that was most commonly used to indicate her role as the queen of the underworld. And you can see that she was the one that received more cultic attention, in the power couple of the underworld, because she could award you a nicer afterlife if you were nice to her. And this happens, you can see that, for example, in the Orphic tablets, in the Orphic text. And then you have and these are the divine and semi-divine beings, and then you have different categories for the undead, especially the troublesome undead, which we are near Halloween, so that's a theme that's interesting for us. You had the buried, that were the ataphoi. We have mentioned, that being buried was an important thing. So the unburied were by definition restless, dead. Then you had the auroi, which were the untimely dead. This means that under this category fell all those that died before their time, but also that specifically failed to achieve the honor that was considered to be like a full wife. So, for example, I don't know, a man that died before being able to marry, a woman that died before being able to have children, which were considered to be, the crowning achievement of male and females. Then you had victims and perpetrators. So those who died a particularly violent death and those who murdered them. They were both restless dead. So yeah. So you see here, there's no moral judgment. Like both of them were affected by this violence in the afterward. And death by murder was a stain on the victim's honor as well. Because if they were not avenged, they kept being restless in the underworld. So it was the family's duty to avenge their murder.
I did not know that. That's amazing.
Yeah, and in some cases, appeasing these restless dead could be a very simple matter, like funerary rites and so on, and you could do that even on an empty grave, if you did not have the body. Okay,
yeah.
But sometimes there were very elaborate rituals that needed to be done, and for example, I wanted to just tell you about this. Is very Halloween themed. There was a very elaborate and gruesome ritual that was enacted on the victim of a murder by the murderer, ideally, that was mascalismos. And we are not exactly certain of how widespread this practice was. But the fact of the matter is that the limbs of the victim were removed, they were cut away, and they were tied to a cord that was tied underneath, on the torso, like underneath the armpit, on the chest, sort of like a bit of a strange belt. And this is a reconstruction that has been done by scholars with the bits and pieces that are mentioned here and there. Of how the process looked like. And it probably was meant to render them unable to fight back against the murderer, to make them powerless in a way in the afterlife. And that is because up until a point, an historical moment in ancient Greek history, the spirits of the dead, they were not thought to be able to affect the living. But after a certain moment in life, they were increasingly more so. So when there was this idea that, there is a restless spirit that is haunting me, that is tormenting me, and they can affect and fuck up my life. So there is the interest to render them powerless even before they can do that.
That's really cool. Thank you. I learned quite a bit there. To what degree does katabasis play in your personal practice? And how can people engage with this in a safe way? Or is katabasis by its very nature a dangerous practice?
I think that if there is a precious lesson that the Greeks are teaching us with their view of the afterlife, is that there is not one underworld, but many. And that its geography and characteristics are not as clearly defined as we would like them to be. And as we would expect them to be in the world of matter, which is the one we mostly live in. So even if it's true that all journeys of the soul present some degree of danger, exactly like mundane life, after all, like we risk death just by crossing the street, or going to eat at the restaurant. So this degree varies a lot depending on the area of the underworld we are talking about. So katabasis is an important part of my personal practice, both from a magical and a spiritual point of view, but I don't delude myself that it's an inherently safe practice. Actually, I don't delude myself that magic in general is inherently safe, but it's not like this deters me from practicing it in the least. Like, it's part of the game. And up to a point, you have to accept it. And as I often tell my students, you can't really practice magic with a condom. And by this, I don't mean that you shouldn't take precautions. Like, you obviously should take precautions, but you can't practice without accepting some degree of, exposure to danger, and as well as to morally gray areas. Like, if you think you can practice by being 100% safe of any danger and 100% certain that you are on the white side, brackets, in the white versus black Manichaean dichotomy, either what you're practicing is not magic, or, even life at all, or you are deluding yourself in a big way, which is very dangerous by itself, in my opinion. And in the specific case of katabasis, I would say that it's good to have solid friendships in low places, so to say, before venturing in the shadier areas of the underworld, to listen to the good advice that you can find hidden in myths and in fairy tales, and also to avoid doing advanced work with the spirits of the dead without a specific training, and also to make good of one of the most important magical tools and undervalued magical tools, which is simple common sense, in my opinion. And, sometimes people will try to put up arguments about how we should really engage only with celestial spirits and to avoid the harmful chthonic ones, which is something that I find not only inherently Christian, and if I wanted to stay, Christian, I would have stayed a good Catholic girl, but also I find it honestly hilariously demented, in the sense that, first of all, a sharp divide between celestial gods, in this context, the Olympians, and chthonic beings never really existed. Like, it's a perception we have, but it was not true. Like, even Zeus had a very important chthonic aspect. And secondly, have these people ever really read the myths and stories about these supposedly celestial beings? I mean, they're hassles. It's not like they're safe people, they're safe beings, And I am not talking about just the Olympians, but, you just have to read the Bible, really. And I have personally frequently found that the gods that are most detached from the physical world, with its creatures and death and decay, are the ones that are more likely to engage in what we would consider cruel acts on a large scale. Not because they are bad, but just because their idea of what is good and what is bad is so removed from our embodied experience.
I'm quite fascinated in this topic specifically because it seems like the classical Olympian gods were whitewashed at some point, and it was probably around what we're talking like the fourth century, third century, fourth century of the Common Era, when the late Platonists began to sort of reinterpret Plato, and then we sort of see this attempt really to sort of make the gods into these like pure or perfect concepts that embody specific aspects of humanity, as opposed to what the original Greeks would have felt, which more like, these are almost living beings. They're evolving, growing, full of flaws, imperfect. Yeah, and then this mode of thinking sort of propagates, I think, then into Christianity in the fourth century, and then Islam, etc., into the future, and we get this distancing of deity from humanity. And like you said, this the more distant it is, the more, how would you put it?
Yeah, it's very interesting, because on the one hand, Greek gods are deeply human, like in many ways. You look at their myths, it's like if you look, for example, at Roman religion, that was very different. Like their gods were not that human. They didn't even have like a human shape before they merged with the complex of Greek myths. But at the same time, if you read their stories, like the thing they will try to bring home again and again and again is their inhumanity. Like they're not humans. They are usually, when they get enraged, they get really enraged and cruel, is because they have to establish, like, we are the gods and you are the humans, and the rules are different for us. You know what I mean? So there is this strange dichotomy there. And yeah, that happened. And it happened more times in history. Like, as you were saying, it happened when they started translating these ancient texts. And so, you know, on the one level, they were fascinated by these ancient people, and they're very sophisticated, you know, myths and stories, but also philosophy and so on and so on. But on the other hand, it was not safe to be fascinated by these pagans. And so they sort of had to turn them into ideas, okay, not gods. But then it happened again during the Romantic era, you know, when there was this return to the gods, but it was romanticized, you know, and that is really, it really affected how modern paganism developed and how people conceive the gods in modern paganism, which is, I think, quite different than how ancient people conceived of them.
The people who are who are creating these translations sort of had this, like you said, romanticized concept of what the ancient Greeks believed. And it's only because they were translating what these philosophers had written and the documents themselves that had survived. So, of course, they were going to get a very slanted understanding. And that understanding of the way that the Greeks interacted with the gods survives into the Victorian era. And that's when we see really this new, well, the revival of magic, as it were.
It's like two polar opposites. On the one hand, you have this romanticized, idealized, you know, idea of the past, especially the classical past, okay, that has been idealized for a long, long time. And on the other hand, you have the sources that were from the Christian apologists. So, you know, of course, they were very, very biased, and they tried to put everything into the worst light possible. And so they were, for example, always talking about human sacrifices and barbaric practices and so on and so on. So when you look at these sources, they really are polar opposites. And yeah, in a way, the history of Western culture is also a history of trying to navigate these two polar opposites and, you know, swinging from one to the other depending on the historical period.
I could talk about this one question forever as well, but we should move on though. So, Jake Stratton Kent made a big point of the necessity of a mythic geography within one's own home, specifically focusing on the idea of the genium domos, a spirit which is called on specifically at the end of the prayer for success, which is found throughout the grimoire genre. In your opinion, how can we engage with the spirit of the house or with the dead in our own home?
It sounds a bit kinky when you put it like that. How can we engage with the spirits of the dead in our... No, okay, I'm a bit of a pervert. Yeah, I mean, you can do that in many different ways. Honestly, just remembering your dead and telling stories about them is a very powerful way to honor them and to empower their spirits. This is, you know, after all, this is the root of the epics. It was, you know, stories about the ancestors so that they would not die, you know. And it is really embedded in our lives in such a way that we don't often give it much notice. But every time that we polish the cupboard that our grandmother loved so much, every time we cook the prized recipe of our mother, or we share a book left to us by our father, we are honoring their memories and nourishing their spirits, also in a very esoteric way. But if we value these gestures and we gain a deeper awareness of what we are doing, we can really turn all these gestures in a blessing on their spirits. And this, by the way, also works in reverse. Like refusing to pronounce the name of a deceased one, and refusing to even mention them in passing or to tell their stories to your descendants or to other people is a very powerful curse by itself, and it affects their destiny in the afterlife, in my opinion. And so since many people struggle with this, I just want to assure people that you don't have to honor all your dead. Like, you don't have to forgive them or help them in the afterlife. Some things should not be forgiven, at least not by us. And if there is a way for them to seek their own atonement, then let them do the work. For once, it is not your responsibility. And of course, you can also do more elaborate work, build an altar. Just please don't build that in your bedroom. That is a big no-no, in my opinion. Present them with regular offerings and keep them abreast of what is going on in your life. The ancient Egyptians did that in a very informal manner by writing letters to the spirits of the dead, and they put them inside the graves, just as you would write to a relative, a loved one, in a very, easy manner.
I love that.
Yeah. And they were telling all the gossip as well, oh, your son is misbehaving this time again, and I am really sick of him. Please try to see if you can do something about that. Yeah, they're very sweet at the same time and hilarious sometimes.
So human, right? We're not so separated, really.
No, not at all. I found one of the things that made me laugh the most was these, that they had in ancient Egypt this collection of wise pronouncements, from the wise ones that were passed on to the sons and etc. in papyri and etc. And there is one pronouncement that says basically, and I may not be translating like that verbatim, but the gist of it is, man, don't be the one that doesn't look around and just says, wife, where is it? Open your eyes and you will find whatever you are seeking. And this, to me, is the proof, that human nature doesn't change.
Wow. That's perfect.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? So, and when you do more elaborate work, there are some, with the spirits of the dead, there are some rules that should be observed when doing this kind of work. And sometimes some of them differ from culture to culture, but as a general rule, the recently dead should not be contacted to do this kind of work. And what I advise in general is that all people that want to do more advanced work with the spirits of the dead, especially if they are not working exclusively with their own ancestors, they should seek a specialized training. If this is one of those magical areas, kind of work that can more easily fuck you up if you don't know what you're doing. And there are many options available depending on the kind of work that you want to do and the kind of path that you follow, the kind of magic that tickles you, so to say. And in fact, I will be teaching an advanced workshop precisely on this topic the next year, together with my friend, Valeria Tresoglio. And for now, the workshop is set to be in Italian only, but if there is enough interest, we are evaluating the idea of offering it in English as well. So we'll see.
That sounds great. Yeah, I would be very interested in taking that myself. So is there a particular way that you personally work with the dead and with your ancestors?
I have an altar to my ancestors, and I engage regularly with some of them that I consider among, my guides and allies. And sometimes I also use necromancy operations that are specifically designed to help me get in touch with an ancestor or an ancestress that holds the specific kind of knowledge that I am seeking, or that has a connection, for example, with a specific culture or practice that I want to get a hold of, so to say. I describe an operation like that in a special addition to my course on female sorcery in the ancient world. As per working like with the spirits of the dead in general, so not just the ancestors, doing various kind of psychopomp work is also part of my practice. And they do it mostly through the spiritual ecosystem that is connected to the cult of Diana Nemorensis. That was the cult of Diana on Lake Nemi, and the main cult of Diana in the ancient world. And lakes in general were seen as a door to the underworld and an ideal place to practice necromancy in general. So the fact that this goddess also was trivia, like Hecate, and could move through the three realms, joined with her fundamental connection with a lake, a sacred lake, makes this goddess and all the spirits of her court a sort of an ideal choice to do this kind of work.
I love that you refer to it as a spirit court.
Yeah, because it is. They like some of these spirits, they exist in other spiritual ecosystems as well, but when they are existing, like when you engage with them through that spiritual ecosystem, you are engaging with the part of them that is, orbiting around that deity and that cult. So it's a very specific, and this is true of every cult, ancient and modern as well.
Yeah, it's something that people in the grimoire tradition are attempting to sort of move towards, the idea of having one's spirit court established. Um, it's something that I think is gaining a lot more traction as opposed to simply conjuring a spirit into a triangle and ordering it to do something for you. You instead establish like you said, an ecosystem about oneself. Yeah.
Because it's more, first of all, on the one hand, I find it better from the point of view of behavior. Like, I don't want to behave in that manner. Of course, there are spirits, and you need the rod sometimes, you know what I mean? Like, you do, but you don't want to use the rod on all the spirits you work with, because otherwise they will just wait for the right moment to stab you in the back. And who wouldn't? If you're an asshole, you're looking for that kind of thing to happen to you. And also, what I personally find is that just like ecosystems, if you build them in an organic manner, they will sustain themselves. And you don't need that much effort to keep it running. And also, it becomes sort of like a family. So they will look out for you, even if you're not looking out for yourself.
Yes, I love it. It's wonderful. So, you also bring up something else in your book that I really thought was fascinating, and I can't wait to read it. Which titans or gods had we best develop relationships with while working this form of necromancy? And what forms of apotropeia do you think are kind of are needed?
If we are speaking about ancient Greek culture specifically, there are certain divine and semi-divine beings that can be more helpful than others. Persephone is the ruler of the underworld you'd better appeal to, as I've said, instead of Hades. And then there are deities like Hermes or Hecate that can act like psychopomps to bring the souls of the dead, to help them in their journey. I know that this sounds a bit like D&D when I say it like that, but I personally find that when venturing in the realm of the dead, you need essentially three kinds of friends, One who knows the ways and holds the keys, so to say, one who is a healer, and one who is an enforcer, meaning that they can get you out of difficult confrontations and dangerous situations. And these characteristics, they can be combined in different ways. Like, they don't have to be, one is this and one is that and the other one is that. But I think that you need all three of these talents, of these capabilities, to be safer, in these kind of journeys. And not to mention the skills, of course, that you hopefully possess on your own. And another very interesting category of spirits are the heroes and the heroines, that by straddling both worlds themselves, they can be particularly good at affecting the spiritual world. like the world of matter, and also in understanding what desires and motivations move humans, which is something that sometimes the gods really struggle with, because it doesn't make much sense to them, but it makes a lot of sense to heroes. And also, I could be biased, but adding to all of this, I think that it is also important to cultivate a relationship with a being that goes beyond the cycles of life and death, like Asteria, for example, with a Titaness, and to be able to really keep a balanced and wide-ranging view when approaching these matters. And also from the point of view of, apotropai, the Greeks heavily emphasized the need to cleanse and purify themselves after getting in touch with the spirits of the dead or everything that was connected to death. And this is certainly good advice, not because they are dead and they are evil, you know what I mean? But because the kind of stuff that you can pick up by hanging out with them can be very harmful to you. So I would say that the first thing you have to take care of is good hygiene, both spiritual hygiene and hopefully, physical one as well. And also for yourself and for the tools that you use. Like, don't use the same tools that you use for this kind of work, for other kinds of work, without thoroughly cleansing them. And this is the basics. Then there is a need to have good allies, as I've said before. And last but not least, there are traditional phylacteries that you can use. Many of them are just a simple object declaring in one way or another that, I am the right to be where I am, and I am under the protection of so-and-so, and specifically, mentioning ritual ties that award you these rights. Like, for example, I don't know, your dedication to a deity or a spirit, or an initiation into the mysteries. So these are all different levels of safety measures that you can use depending on what you're doing and on what is needed.
So you mentioned the Titans, and you also say in the book that we don't talk about them enough. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, this is like a double meaning pun in a way, because it's true that we don't mention the Titans as much, but it's also true that the ancient Greeks didn't as well. Like, they tended not to talk much about the Titans, and this was partly because there was like, they were thought to be deeply connected with chthonic, powers, and so it could bring out bad luck for people to talk about that. That's why they tended to use euphemisms, like, the ones that does so and so, like they did for the Furies or any other kind of spirit that was potentially baneful. But on the other hand, the Titans were they were used to express the potentially violent forces and uncivilized forces that were opposed to the balance and the order that was exemplified by the Olympians, and sometimes people tend to interpret the Titans as a different generation of gods in a very historical sense. Like, before, there was this other religion that was based on these beings, and then afterwards there was this new culture, and they were supplanted, and so on and so on. But when you really look into it, like all major scholars agree that this is very oversimplified. Like, this myth of an older generation that is supplanted by another generation is a Near Eastern myth. We find it in the myths of the Hittites. I don't know, that's how you pronounce them. So it is more about expressing in a mythical sense, what they are, the kind of development that they are trying to express, that human beings get civilized, that they gain control, and so they are able to live together in a society with rules, instead of being, oh, there was this religion and then there was this other religion, if you know what I mean. So yeah, it is this way for us, but it was that way for them as well, even if they had some way of saying that included the Titans. For example, you could say old as Kronos, just as we say, old as balls.
Nice. So we've gotten this far into the conversation, and we haven't yet mentioned the Greek magical papyri, which seems a little strange given the subject that we're discussing. How do you incorporate it into your work, if at all?
Okay, so the fact that the PGM, Greek magical papyri, nowadays get treated as if they were a coherent grimoire instead of an eclectic collection of texts coming from different times and places is somewhat of a pet peeve of mine.
Yes, me too, yeah.
So, of course, these texts, they arise from a common cultural milieu. The Greeks would have said a koine, a cultural koine. And they are extremely important when it comes to understanding the magic, the kind of magic that was practiced in the Mediterranean area, especially in late antiquity. But they should not be taken as a coherent instruction manual or as the faithful representation of all kinds of magic that were practiced in those times, if for no other reason that one needed to be able to read and write in order both to access these texts and to add to them, So I personally don't give the PGM or any other collection of ancient magical texts any special meaning from a magical spiritual point of view. I mean, it's not a vintage holy book for me, if you know what I mean. But what they are is very precious sources, and I studied them to better understand the magic of the ancient world and also magic in general. But with that being said, my favorite part of the PGM is probably book 20 of the PGM, which is GEMF 3 for the ones that follow the newer, catalog. And that is one of the oldest texts of the PGM. It's dated between the end of the first BCE and the beginning of the first CE. And it mentions not one, but two women as the authors of the recipes that are contained in it. And I find it very, very satisfying that two women are credited as experts, in one of the oldest documents contained in a collection that is believed and held by many to be the foundation of the kind of so-called brackets high magic, that many, even to this day, unfortunately, consider to be the exclusive domain of men.
Oh yes, that's wonderful. Yeah. No, we need to get rid of that concept entirely, that it's a male-driven practice. Yes. I love that. Thank you for sharing. I'm going to have to go and look up that chapter specifically because I'm not familiar with it off the top of my head. But thank you for that. Great. So you have included a substantial section on the mysteries. Could you describe what your goals were in including this section within the book?
I wanted to offer a general overview of the mysteries as a religious phenomenon that in many ways was at the heart of ancient Greek religion. So, of course, there is a big and detailed section on the Eleusinian mysteries, but there are also descriptions of other lesser known mysteries, like the mysteries of Despoina, and the Kabairoi, for example. And I don't think that the mysteries, by virtue of their very nature, can really be explained or understood. I think that they are just meant to be experienced. And I think that every time we try to explain them out in a way that makes sense to us, like as, fertility rites or as massive drug announced raves, for example, we are entirely losing the point. So this is why, apart from all the historical details and the theories regarding the origins of each, different mysteries, I have tried to let the reader imagine how it must have been to, to walk and chant for hours under the sun, to dance until you drop, to walk in darkness and suddenly see the light. So these were powerful, really life-changing experiences, and people spent a lot of money and time and resources in order to be able to participate to them. So if we keep being puzzled about their motivations, is because we think that everything that holds any value can be explained or understood, which is simply a bold-faced lie, in my opinion. And in my heart, I hope that people will see this section of the book more as instructions, than as explanations. Like, if you want to explore the mysteries, this is how you do it.
Excellent. Yes. Always be suspicious of anyone that says that they understand exactly what the mysteries are.
Yeah, I mean, it defeats the purpose, doesn't it?
So, what are your main book recommendations then for people who are interested in becoming familiar with both Greek religion, mythology, magic?
Okay, so there are a ton of good resources out there. I will just, give you some main references. There is, for example, Ancient Greek Religion by John Mikalson, which is a wide-ranging handbook that tries to give a general, a perspective of the religious dimension in ancient Greece. Then there is the classic, which is Greek Religion by Burkert. And as you can expect from Burkert, there is an emphasis on structures, and functions, that is predominant. And there is less attention on the personal and collective relationship with the divine, Then there is the Oxford Handbook of Ancient Greek Religion. That is also, this is evidently targeted at professionals. So if you're not looking for this kind of thing, it's better avoided, because it doesn't have the aim of giving you a general overview, but it strives to paint more like the picture of the current state of affairs in that field. Okay, where is the research at right now? There is also a companion to Greek Religion by D.Ogden. And it is a collection of essays. So there is a sort of a multi-focused effect instead of a broad-ranging description. Then you have Ancient Greek Cults by Larson. This is an analysis of the main cults of ancient Greece, associated, like divided in chapters between different gods and goddesses. And the emphasis is specifically on the archaeological point of view, and so cult places and testimonies of various ritual practices. And finally, you have The Gods of Ancient Greece by Bremmer and Erskine. This is also a collection of scholarly essays, and again, you have like a deep diving into specific subjects more than a broad overview. And when it comes to Greek mythology, I can also recommend, this is a classic, like Greek Mythology by Graf, which is more focused on myth, like as what myth was in ancient Greece and what purposes did it serve, more than, the stories. Then you have Theories of Mythology, like Csapo, which is similar in its focus. And if you want to deepen the study of the main themes in Greek mythology, so more into the stories, there is Interpretations of Greek Mythology by Bremmer, Jan Bremmer. Yeah.
Wow. Right. Well, you've just bankrupted me, I think. I'm gonna have to go and look at quite a few of those because they're not on my shelf. But thank you so much for sharing them. That's a really great list. Have you also read, is it Sarah Johnson's The Restless Dead?
Yeah. Yeah, of course. That's a classic.
Yeah. If people aren't familiar with that, I would add that to the very robust list that you just gave us.
Yeah, that is specifically, on, and there is also another book on like death in ancient Greece, which I think is, I could look that up if you want, but it's the Greek way of death, the ancient Greek way of death, I think.
Thank you so much for coming onto the show today, Giulia. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. Do you have anything else that you are working on at the moment, or anything that you're obsessed with currently?
I'm always obsessed by too many things at once. But at the moment, I am excited about the new course that I'm offering on my website on the ancient cults of Hecate. That is an in-depth analysis of the goddess from an historical point of view that I believe has not been offered yet, to my knowledge, especially in the English language. And I'm also stoked that this winter I will be offering for the very first time my advanced course on the witchcraft of Diana. And this is a work that is focused on practical witchcraft in the context of my personal work with Diana Nemorensis. And it's really fundamental to my personal practice, and I'm deeply passionate about it. So since it's an advanced course, only those that have already completed the introductory course, that is Diana, the Lake, and Her Mysteries, that is also available on my website, will be able to access, the advanced one. And by the way, like my website, you will find the link in the description, and it's boscodiartemisia.com. And also last summer, I organized the Lunar Witchcraft Retreat, a 1-week retreat in Italy with many fantastic teachers. And it was a blast, really. So I am going to do this again in the summer of 2026. There are already some awesome teachers, like from all over the world, that have confirmed their presence. And we will focus on another type of planetary magic. So I'm really excited about it. And last but not least, I am already working on another book that will be focused. This one will be focused on the techniques of Italian traditional witchcraft, like the real one, not the new agey version. And I have been wanting to do this for so long, and I think that now may be the right time to do that.
Excellent, excellent. Well, just for our audience, I think the book that we've been talking about today, titled "The Key to Ancient Greek Religion" by Giulia, will be available in 2025.
Yeah, I think so. If the editor doesn't die by suicide, I hope so.
I hope they're surviving. But yes, we've already mentioned it, but it is a very large book. So I'm very much looking forward to sharing it with everybody. But yes, excellent. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today, Giulia. It's been really lovely.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here with you.
That was Giulia Turolla discussing her book, The Key to Ancient Greek Religion, which will, all things going well, be available from Hadean Press in the second half of 2025. A text well worth gracing our shelves, given its scope and breadth, which I am confident will make it a modern classic. I think it's quite clear that Giulia is at the top of her field when it comes to her understanding of the historical intricacies of ancient Greek culture. I was particularly taken by her interpretation of the eternal returns of the past and the manner in which mythic events, like the bones and hair of a decomposing corpse, are subsumed within the fertile soil of history, and how we can step into these mythic spaces to allow the past to transform us in the present. There's just such a wonderful organic quality to her definition, which really speaks to me. I was also really taken by Giulia's explanation of the breadth of classifications of the restless dead and of the often macabre extremes people would go to in an effort to avoid having such a shade attached to them. There was also her extremely practical advice on the manner in which we should consider developing our spirit court, bringing in her expertise in the field of ancient Greek culture to inform our modern developments. I am very much looking forward to Giulia writing more so that we can have her back on the show one day for more fascinating conversation about the gods and the dead. For more from Giulia, all of the links mentioned as well as her book recommendations can be found in the description below. If you have listened this far, thank you all so very much. You really help our statistics online To further appease the gods of the algorithm, I humbly ask that you like, share, and subscribe to this podcast for more amazing interviews with Hadean Press's global authorship. Anything that you can do to help us reach a wider audience will be so very, very appreciated. Stay tuned for more to come in the future, and thank you all for your continued support, and I will see you all again in the next one.